A little bit later on, the results will be officially released in terms of a declaration by the Electoral Commission. We hope we'll see around about 6 o'clock. We believe that that's when it's going to happen. Well, I'm now joined by analyst Angelo Fick, who's the Director of Research at the AWOL Socio-Economic Research Institute. Thanks so much for joining us, Angelo.
Hello.
All right, so one doesn't even know where to begin, really. I had a sense before these elections happened that no matter what happens, there would be a very different South Africa post the results coming out. They may look a bit familiar in terms of who's the majority, who isn't, but am I right in saying that things are quite different now?
They're very different for the the two large parties. The majority party has returned with a smaller margin of the voters. Across various provinces, the official opposition has performed less well than it did last time. And this is a wake-up call for the kind of politics that those two parties have been sort of promulgating. We must also not forget that this is the election in which the majority of young people who are registered many people didn't vote, and then a majority of first-time voters weren't even registered, those were eligible. So there's certainly a shift in the dynamics of the South African political economy that parties would have to look to.
So let's talk about these major parties. What didn't they see that they should have seen, or were they paying too much attention to social media and being misled by noise that was not relevant?
I'm not certain how much attention they do pay to social media, because they do run their own polls on the ground, and they do have, for the two big parties, structures on the ground from which they can get information. But I do think in South Africa we tend to give too much credence to the sort of louder voices on social media platforms and assume that social media discussions reflect South Africa more generally. And here one thinks through Njabulu Ndebele's rediscovery of the ordinary. It may be important for all of us to rediscover the ordinary in South Africa and stop paying so much attention to the spectacular, because, to go again via Steve Biko, the exception does not disprove the rule. In fact, that is why it is the exception.
All right, let's start trying to look at this sort of province by province. And I want to start with Gauteng, because, that was always going to be the tightest one, especially after the local government elections. And that gave us a clue for the first time that there had been a shifting of the sands. The ANC crossed literally by a hair's breadth. Was that something that you saw coming?
The narrowness of the margin slightly surprised me, but I didn't think that there was enough going on. And I think people compared the 2019 possibilities with the 2016 municipal results, but actually it was much more important to compare it to the 2014 general elections, because people behave so differently. In municipal elections, people generally have the face and name of a local ward councillor. There are very specific local political issues that they want that particular face and name and voice to respond to, and that the party is not a secondary but an additional concern. In the national elections, it really is about the larger party vision, what they see as the party's wrongdoing and right doing, and the two big parties played some spectacular mishits during these elections. And the two big opposition parties, both the Economic Freedom Fighters and the Democratic Alliance, have to ask themselves, the EFF less so because they did gain, why, with an African National Congress as hampered with corruption allegations, with maladministration and mismanagement allegations, with a kind of spectacular wronggoings in that party's internal dynamic, they couldn't appeal to the majority of the voters in a bigger way. The Democratic Alliance's decrease in the share of the vote should certainly be a wake-up call to it, that its interregnum status, unable to let go of the past, unable to embrace the future in a majority black young country, isn't going to be working as a sustainable way of, becoming the party of governance in the future.
So we were listening to Panyaza Lesufi just now, and the post-mortems are there, trying to figure out what went wrong and trying to point to certain things. Was it e-tolls? Was it life esidimeni? What was it in the end? And I wonder, if we start at the top, was it that Cyril Ramaphosa came just in time to just get over the line, or do you think there were other factors? Because depending who you ask inside the ANC, some are going to give him the credit and some are saying it's a team effort. What do you think, in the end, helped them cross the line? Because it did look like they weren't going to do great, but somehow they got enough just to get over.
So snatching victory from the jaws of defeat seems to be, something the ANC is very good at. And that's partly to do with their organizational mechanisms and their ability to mobilize on the ground ahead of an election. That, of course, will not work in perpetuity. So again, Panyaza Lesufi talks about the spectacular elements of maladministration, but people in South Africa also don't just vote against what failed, they vote for what succeeded. And too often in South Africa, we don't pay enough attention to just how much has changed for many people in South Africa in the 25 years. In the quarter of a century, all sorts of issues of education, all sorts of issues of equality, of opportunity have shifted in favor of the majority black South Africans. We do not live in the same legislated white supremacist state we lived in 25 years ago. That is often obscured by the spectacular failures of governance of the ANC. Textbook delivery lack of teachers in classrooms, lack of quality education, the spectacle of life esidimeni, the fact that it still takes 2.5 hours on a public bus from Protea Glen when it can take 35 minutes from Rosebank to Pretoria on a train. Who benefited spectacularly from post-apartheid South Africa shifts depending on where you go. And I think that the African National Congress in Gauteng, the wealthiest province, the economic heartland of the country, they would have to wake up and realize that being the face on time of inequality isn't just something that happens in the suburbs. It's something that happens every day in the lives of millions of South Africans. And there is the mandate to perform. Because if you look at what the economic freedom fighters promised and why they gained, it's precisely because the vision of South Africa in its contemporary moment is so radically at odds with what was dreamed of in 1994.
All right, so we're not going to get through all the provinces, but there are a couple that interest me in particular. Mpumalanga, the official opposition has changed hands, and you talked about these young Turks, I guess we can call them. Why did the EFF do well there, particularly?
So again, it speaks to the vision that is being offered to people. We in the middle classes and many of the intelligentsia in this country believe that centrist parties are the future. Tariq Ali in the United Kingdom, looking at world politics, talks about the dangerous centre, because the idea of centrism is precisely to continue the status quo in some respects. And for millions of people, the last 25 years have not delivered enough. It's not enough that what they dreamt of and what they were promised in 1994 has been delivered patchily or in part. They certainly see that there is a class of people who have done very well over the last quarter century, and they have not done well at all. They send their children to schools, and those children may not come back because of infrastructure, poor toilet provision. They send their children to school, and those children may not be taught because teachers don't appear. They send their children to school, and half of those children may drop out because of the poor quality of education and become perpetually unemployed in a country with 54% youth unemployment. They see that, and they know that the vision that is being offered to them isn't enough, and so they start embracing alternative visions. And that's where I think the economic freedom fighters did speak to people. Whether or not they will fulfill on that mandate should they ever get into governance is a separate question. But the two big parties certainly have to think that in places like Mpumalanga, where there is issues of unemployment, issues of community safety, issues of education and service delivery, it certainly is something when the official opposition shifts to a party that promises a very different and radically, diametrically opposed vision of a South Africa that is closer to what many people believe they were promised in 1994.
All right, so still with the EFF, some people might say they underperformed actually, even though when we look at it, 10% is a huge chunk. The expectations for some were much higher, especially given that 2014, they'd been around for months and got 6%. Should the jump have been bigger, or this is as best as they could have done?
I don't think that the jump should be poo-pooed as some kind of, minor achievement. If we look at other parties and we see the number of parties that performed really well in 2009, and here I'm thinking specifically of COPE and its trajectory from almost 2 million votes to votes in the thousands, that is a trajectory that could have gone the way of the EFF. And I'm not praising the EFF at all. I'm deeply critical of all sorts of policies and visions that they have. But one must respect the fact that in 2 elections, a party can go from 6 to 10%, to go from single digits to double digits, when there are parties in Parliament that have struggled with single digits and have struggled to hang on. And so there is something going on there that if one pays attention to electoral behavior, one has to ask not just what are they saying, and I think it's silly and quite superficial to dismiss it as populism. It is to dismiss the many millions of people who vote and support them as somehow naive and falling for populism. I think it is important to pay attention seriously and take respectfully people's electoral behavior, just as we should take seriously the people who voted for the Freedom Front Plus and the people who voted for other small parties. They're signalling something about their vision of contemporary South Africa and what is on offer by the large parties. And it is the larger parties who said, don't vote for smaller parties, it's a waste of your vote, which is again deeply disrespectful of those voters who do vote for small parties for very principled reasons or because of their disillusion with the larger players.
All right, talking again, bigger parties and their misfortunes. The Democratic Alliance, we cross to KwaZulu-Natal now, and they made some inroads in some areas, but overall became the third in the pecking order. Was it because the IFP got better, or what other factors played out for the DA there?
So the IFP certainly did gain from the spectacular demise of the NFP. So the National Freedom Party's really strange performance in 2016 meant that the party started, shall we say, just falling into disarray. But the Democratic Alliance must also look internally for some of the reasons, because in South Africa, not just in politics, but in sport, in everyday life, we tend to project the reasons for our failure or underperformance onto the behavior of others. It is often our own behavior that explains much better why it is we do the ways that we do. And the Democratic Alliance must introspect and think about how its vision of the future of South Africa isn't appealing to the majority of South Africans and doesn't seem to gel with their experience of this contemporary moment. That people like Helen Zille and Tony Leon had a particular vision that was of their time. And those who buy into that vision may have to think very critically about, in a majority black country, in a majority young country, if you have your eye on political power, what is the game that you have to play? The game that you have to play is you have to understand the world in the terms of the people who are the majority. And that is certainly not what one hears often out of senior politicians in the DA. And that internal conflict around issues of affirmative action, issues of the notions around which we're going to build the future, the idea of equal opportunity in the most unequal society in the world cannot have the contradictions that you have and appeal to millions of people that you want to have vote for you. You cannot then suggest that they are somehow unsophisticated and this vanguardist position that you hold, knowing better, is somehow that something they should just buy into. That's the same failure that in some respects pockmarked the ANC in its vision of, we are the vanguardists, we lead the vision and the rest must follow. That doesn't work in this world anymore.
All right, so we're going to carry on with our chat, but I'm getting a sense that over the years the world has been changing, but our politics possibly hasn't been keeping up, and that now a whole new order is required from everybody, literally, in how to do politics in South Africa. We'll continue to unpack that as we look at other provinces. We'll take a quick break and we'll be back right after this. Stay with us.